Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the Beit Midrash. Good to have you here, and good to be learning with you today. As we're going to continue our exploration and discussion of To Be a Jew Today by Noah Feldman. And as we get to part two, chapter four, which I didn't mark my book properly, so I was finding the beginning of the chapter again. Uh, that'll be our kind of our main focus. Opening thoughts, comments, questions that you get, questions or reactions that y'all might have had to this chapter. Yes, Ellen.
Well, I just want to, I'm not going to offer to do it, but in collecting and separating and organizing my dad's papers, the evidence of his era, which would have been right after the war until about 75, 1975. I came across one letter that I I thought of Xeroxing it and sending it to you because it's such a picture of where he was and where it was possible to be in Birmingham, Alabama in 1970 with these kinds of ideas. He's refuting a lecture that he's heard from a professor, Fine, and I don't want to be the one to read it, but it's written on January 20th, 1970, as a reaction to this Professor Fine and to who had spoken here and with whom my dad seemed to have disagreed about whatever he might have mentioned. And
Interesting.
well, it puts us and our city and what it was possible to do and not do into this particular chapter. This is where the debates are going on and understood and in the later phase. But if I had not read this book, this wouldn't have meant exactly the same thing to me.
So, what was his dispute with Professor Fine?
Well, Professor Fine says he writes, he was able and bright, but he did not discuss what I understood to be the subject, Jews and the urban crisis. For example, little or nothing was said about what we as citizens can do in dealing with the employment problems of the hardcore unemployed. In regard to preserving public school systems, though the stresses through the stresses of integration, a public school system which is an absolute necessity if we are to have a reasonably free.
Well, I don't. We don't need you to read the whole letter. I was just curious what
Yeah,
Professor Fine was talking about.
that's it.
No,
That's it. And then the first paragraph. But it is, he ends by saying it's a strange feeling to be attacked by the George Wallaces of the world because we're liberals, and at the same time, in effect, to be criticized and mostly sneered at by the folks like Rabbi Fine, who is, well, it's just I don't have it marked and I'm not going to be able to find it. But oh, well, it's obviously the moment when the Jewish day school was created and he was concerned about the loss of public education, which when I look at today's world, I can't help but think about what a majority of our children seem to be getting, whether it's at home or wherever.
Yeah, I hear you, and I'm not sure the scope of this class is going to solve the public education crisis in
Or
our
hardly,
city, state, or country. So,
certainly not.
thank you for sharing. Any other thoughts, comments, reactions?
I- I'll say, to expand on what I said last week, I really don't think I'm qualified or really should be able to have a right to discuss with anybody in Israel what their politics are like, because this chapter gave so many examples of all the divergent ideas that you have in Israel, and I can't discuss it with anybody.
Yeah. There's some interesting things around that, and I do know you mentioned it last week. I just didn't mention this last week. There's. I'm trying to remember exactly when. It was probably somewhere around 10, 15 years ago when something political was going on. Rabbi Daniel Gordis, who is a prominent conservative rabbi in Israel, um, there was a lot of criticism coming from the U.S. and Rabbi Gordis essentially wrote a note saying, you know, similar to what you're saying, Eddie. Like, you're not here, you don't know the situation, you're not here, stay out of it. Until you're here living in Israel, you have no right to be getting involved in Israeli politics. And then probably about 3 to 4 years ago, it's probably about 2.5, 3 years ago, when there was all the uproar around the judicial reforms, he co-wrote a letter saying, "American Jews, we need you to step in and voice your displeasure with the Israeli politics." And I'm like, Rabbi, like, you can't have it both ways. You can't have it that um, when you're feeling getting like you're getting criticized, you don't want to hear it, but when you are agreeing with us, you suddenly want us to voice our displeasure. So there is something where I think Israel does, as I think we did discuss this last week, or it was in the book last week, that Israel have a lot does get a lot of support from the American Jewish community, and so there is some voice we can have. But yes, we're not there, and we don't know the actual situation, and we don't vote. So that is to some extent limited as well. Joshua?
Yeah, I guess I was going to say along those lines, one of the things I like about this book so much is that it really is an issue insofar as Israel just wants to call itself Israel and be a nation state. I don't think it's any of my business more than I can tut at Russia or Pakistan or India or all sorts of places. But insofar as Israel wants to be the Jewish state and the Jewish homeland, it kind of makes it my problem to relate to it. And I think that's one of his things is like, you can't not relate to it. The whole world, yesterday, I'm a bike racing fan. There's a team called Israel Premier Tech. And during the middle of one of the race, these protesters jumped out to interrupt the riders from the Israel Premier Tech team, none of whom are Israeli, because the fact that they're Israel, that Israel's on the name makes people feel like they have something to do with Israel. In the same way, like just being Jewish makes people feel like we have something to do with Israel. So we can't avoid it. I'm certainly not going to give Israel policy recommendations as a state, but I have to think about what it means for me as a Jew.
Cindy?
I just wanted to add that I had the realization that that what Israel does isn't necessary, like what Josh says, it has implications for me as a Jew. It also, I realize, has implications for me as Americans, because if you look at what happened, like at Microsoft, where they were attacking, some young people stormed Microsoft because they didn't like Microsoft's policies dealing with Israel. It's fuel. So what's happening in Israel now is fueling the discontent here in the U.S. And so I think that with a smaller world, if what is going on in this other place has such dramatic consequences in our country, I think that it I'm not saying to not support Israel. I do support Israel. I will always support Israel. However, I do believe that I'm not allowed. I need to have an opinion because it really does affect me directly here in the United States as a Jew and as an American.
Yeah, and the way he kind of frames this chapter, I think, highlights that a little bit. If you look at what his arguments in this chapter, part of what he says is originally, starting in even before 1948, but for many years, traditionalists, broadly speaking, the Orthodox and right-wing Orthodox, the traditionalists were anti-Zionist. Why? That was not a rhetorical question.
Okay, because it wasn't up to us to go to the land. It required the Messiah coming first, and then we would go to the land. We couldn't force it.
Exactly. Like he has this conversation about the three oaths around 217, 218, in which it's God adjured the nations that that was the first one, that Israel should not go up in a wall, like they should not scale the wall. That it's not our job as people to resettle the land of Israel and declare a Jewish state. God will do that in God's own time. And when God is ready for there to be a Jewish state of Israel, God will bring the Messiah and God will allow us to do that. So that was kind of the decades of anti-Zionism from the traditionalist camp for a long time. Now, what does he say was? What is his argument about what happens? Particularly, well, I think it was he said it was after the '67 war. They realize the state of Israel is not going anywhere, so they have to engage with it as a Jewish state in some way, shape, or form, because you can't. The fighting against its right to exist is no longer a question. Like, it's established, it's there. So the question is no longer should there be a Jewish state, it's how do we relate to a Jewish state? And that becomes the new framing for the traditionalist camp. Is how do we, okay, so this state is here, now what? And therein is how where he outlines the various ideas from Chabad and the Chazon Ish, and how it differs from, and later on, the Hilltop Youth, on how that shift has happened and the details of what that shift was. Thoughts, comments?
Well, Rabbi, sometimes I find the reading of the book a little dense for me. I mean, it's just hard reading. It's hard to separate all the little differences that people believe in. But what did become clear, I thought he did a good job at explaining the Chabad in its entirety. And the first thing that he talked about was going out into the world. That Chabad, wherever there are Jews, Chabad goes, right? So the whole deal about there being whether Jews should come to Israel or not, this whole Aliyah thing. I mean, the Chabad people have accepted the reality that there are Jews everywhere. And they rather than having the Jews come to Israel, they are going to go find the Jews and work with the Jews wherever they happen to be. So it's another one of those practical realities that I think comes up multiple times in this book, that no matter what your philosophical bent is, that you have to deal with what the reality is now.
Yes. Um, yes, and I think that's the challenge for all of the disparate um, groups that he talks about the progressives, the evolutionists, the traditionalists. I think that's the reality for all of them. Is how does our worldview reflect the reality around there, and how do we minimize the dissonance um, between our worldview and what the reality is?
Well,
Esther.
yeah, maybe you can talk about one of it. He had those three points of view about Chabad, what the Rebbe how he has organized his Chabad movement. But since this chapter and a lot of the book is about Israel and what are we going to do, how do we view Israel being, especially being in the diaspora, uh, I think he tried to create some argument about um, the about Israel uh, being in existence because that's what the people, that's what we need. We need, for the diaspora needs Israel. We don't have to um, have the argument that we have to have the Aliyah. We need Israel, and I think that was part of his argument uh, for Israel to exist. So the whole chapter, I think, got a little bit fuzzy to me when as he talked about different uh, points of view about what Israel is. But that I think became somewhat clear for me about his point about the Chabad movement and its relationship to Israel.
Yeah, and I think it was an interesting twist that he talks about the Rebbe making between. Um, I'm looking at page 229 that Jews have a obligation doraita. There's a mitzvah doraita. There's an obligation from the Torah to defend themselves, and that the state of Israel, and specifically the IDF, is now taking on that obligation for us. And so, which is a very different shift from the old anti-Zionist, there shouldn't be a state at all, to relying on the state and the IDF um, to be the protectors of the Jewish people. Esther, you had your hand up before.
I think one of the things that's interesting to me about this book, in some ways, he does this in his introduction. He doesn't really, you're not really sure what his point is, but what he does give you is this history of Israel and America and Jews, and draws a picture of how we are increasingly interconnected. This chapter actually was very disturbing and frightening to me. And it was also, I agree, very dense. It was hard to pick out all the subtleties of these little differences. But what I think became clear ultimately is, it's not the olden days when you could say, well, I'm a Zionist or I'm not a Zionist, or I think Israel should exist or shouldn't exist, or I should have an opinion about politics or I shouldn't have an opinion about politics. We are enmeshed. And, I was in Costa Rica last week and ended up at a Shabbat dinner with a conservative rabbi that we ultimately got into some political discussion. And from some of his remarks, I knew pretty quickly he was a Trump supporter, and understood that there were some things about Trump that he, even though there was a lot of misunderstanding about some of the things he thought Trump was doing, that Israel and his supposed support of Israel were very clear. I don't think, I don't pretend to be able to know anything about or be able to advise anything about Israel policy or any of that stuff. I don't, like Eddie, I don't feel like I can have a real say so. But I think that we are all affected, and this book shows that dramatically. I think the other thing I just realized, we have some fringe elements in our religion, and I don't care where they live, whether it's in Israel or, wherever, these fringe elements impact all of us. And it's scary to me.
Yeah, and I think, the part that scared me a little bit reading this was the fringe elements you're talking about are not becoming so fringe, that they're gaining some political power and influence, even though they remain primarily on the fringe. Um, talking about what he loosely calls the hilltop youth towards the end of the chapter, but that Ben Gavir, who's now the Minister of National Security, kind of ascribes to much of that, which is a pretty powerful position to be in the government, to have for a fringe member to have in that kind of influence. Lisa, I saw your hand earlier, and then we'll come back down.
Yeah, so I guess sort of think the Rebbe was brilliant in his way, in some ways, or he was able to embrace the reality of Israel, maybe because of what Stuart said, because Israel exists, and without really without being Zionistic, without thinking everybody should move there, without thinking we have to be there before the Messiah comes, even though he believes in the coming of the Messiah. And it's just so interesting to me that he just avoided having sort of any sort of overriding philosophy about Israel, but yet the Chabad people I know have a great love for Israel. So I assume that came from the Rebbe, that he encouraged this great love for Israel, and that I think he's saying that when the Messiah does come, the Messiah will take his or her rightful place as the sovereign of Israel. So that Israel is part of that messianic vision, but it's not necessary for the messianic vision. But like I said, it's just so interesting to me that there is such a great love for Israel among Chabad people, without the Rebbe having ever really had, told people to go there or not to go there, or without having a philosophy, with being, what does he call it, like non-Zionist or something? He's not anti-Zionist, but he's not pro-Zionist. He's just sort of like neutral Zionist. But yet the Chabad people love Israel. So it's it's interesting and a little confusing. And either he was, I don't know if he was, I have to believe that he was like deliberate in the way, what he chose not to do.
Yeah, I think Feldman kind of implies that also, that the fact he didn't give a explicit philosophy on how Chabad should relate to Israel was probably not accidental, because he was very thoughtful and intentional on a lot of other things. That the absence of it kind of implies he probably didn't. There's a reason he probably didn't publicly put that out. But like the state is kind of a precursor. He uses the word precursor of this messianic vision. It's kind of almost like a beginning of this messianic vision, which will eventually be fulfilled when all Jews are kind of ready for it to happen. So it's a good reading that it's an interesting way to play both sides.
Right.
The state is here, and it has the potential of being here to be kind of this early model of what the messianic age can look like if we structure this correctly. But it's not a messianic age, so it doesn't really matter at this point, and we can't really force the issue because the issue will come when God wants it to come. So, we will send our shlichim out
Everywhere.
and not encourage people to make aliyah because we, as we said, that's the one of the three oaths that he mentions is we're not going to encourage it. People, it'll happen in its own time when God is ready for it to happen. But in the meantime, like we can try to encourage the state of Israel to live up to its Jewish potential of what it can be. And so that's an interesting balancing way to
Right. He sort of plays both sides. But like I said, it is just so interesting that there is, out of that came such a love for Israel, at least among the Chabad people I know.
Well, it's the majority of Jews in the world in Israel, and I would think that that would generate a lot of love because you're celebrating the people, or the Jews. I mean, and that's where they want to be. Their whole focus is on flourishing Jewish life, and where is there a flourishing of Jewish life but in Israel? It's amazing. So it sort of makes sense to me. I have some questions about the messianic kind of issues. We as conservative Jews, we never really talked about the Messiah much. It wasn't a thing. And in reading this chapter, you realize that so much of, well, it seems, and maybe I'm wrong, that so much of a traditionalist Judaism, which I lump all of that together, is driven by this messianic vision and for some of the more extreme views in the body of a human being, which is very foreign to me and frankly feels very Christian to me. What is that about?
look. I think there's a couple questions embedded in that question. Um, I think one is, does conservative Judaism not really talk about or focus on the Messianic age or believe in a Messiah? Broadly speaking, the conservative movement has always kind of tried to be a big tent kind of movement, where it had some basic foundational beliefs, but there was a lot of diversity within that big tent. Um, so there are both historically and practically now conservative Jews who believe in a personal Messiah who will come back and redeem the world and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Is it a huge focus of most conservative ideology? Not as much, but if you look at the prayer book, you look at the Siddur, it's still scattered all throughout there. The Siddurim between the conservative and the Orthodox are not drastically different in that respect. Now, the bigger question is why? Like, why has the conservative movement played down some of this messianism? I don't think there's a single answer to that question. I think one, if you look at the history of messianism, it doesn't generally doesn't play out particularly well. There's been a lot more false messiahs than there have been true ones. So I think there's always a little bit of hesitation to go too far down the messianic path, because I'm not even sure we would, if the Messiah came today, would we all agree on that person was the Messiah? So I think that's one of the issues. I think, Stuart, I see you. Let me just kind of finish this train of thought for a minute or two. Second, I do think there's a level at which Christianity has such a focus on Jesus as Messiah that, particularly living in a Christian culture, we have tried to move away from that and tried to put less focus on an individual Messiah, as like we're differentiating ourselves from the Christians in that sense. And even if we say we want a Messiah and there's a messianic age, what does that mean? What does that look like? What are we actually looking for and praying for? And again, in a big tent movement, I think it's easier to avoid that conversation so as not to stir up controversy than it is to come to a consensus. Now, Orthodoxy has, as I said, the Siddur is pretty openly talks about praying for a messianic age. One of Maimonides' 13 principles of faith is a Messiah, so and resurrection of the dead and all these kinds of things. So it's pretty embedded in theology. But again, what does it mean? And I think on some level, the Rebbe was so revered for all that he did and who he was as an individual within the Chabad movement that they kind of started to associate him with with him being a potential Messiah. You hear all the stories about him, and you talk to people who spoke with him, and yeah, I mean, that wouldn't be too far off of what we want a Mashiach to look like. Like somebody who was kind to everyone, who was always willing to help other people. Like you go down the whole list, he was just he wanted to improve Jewish life throughout the world. You can easily see, listening to the stories, why they might make that association. The fact he may or may not have actually approved of it is a little, hard to tell if he actually did or not. But I think that's kind of at least the denominational difference. And I think if you use Feldman's breakdown, I think you'd see something similar, where progressive Jews would look at a messianic age. They wouldn't be so concerned with a personal Messiah as much as they would be concerned with a world of justice and peace and equality and compassion and all those kinds of things. I think evolutionists would see it as a process that we're getting towards, that we're trying to move our way towards. Martin Luther King's the arc of history is long but bends towards justice. That's an evolutionist way of thinking about it, that we're going to be moving towards this messianic age, but it's going to be a process to get there. The traditionalists are looking at it as an individual who will usher in this time. Does that sort of answer the question? Your statement about Christianity. That's not the first time I've heard that about Chabad either. Not saying I necessarily agree, but there is something about the Messiah, the potential Messiah dying, and then expecting him to come back when the time is right, does sound very similar to Christian ideology. Um, so yeah, not the first person I've heard make that
I didn't even realize that the Chabad community felt, or some of the Chabad community felt that way. It was a surprise to me actually to in all of those, not just Chabad, to think of the Messiah as a person, since I always thought of it as a state of being, you know, a world of peace. So it was surprising to me to think of it in terms of that we as Jews think of it in terms of a person, or some Jews
Yeah, I mean,
do.
you look at the rabbinic texts on it, and they talk about a Mashiach ben David, someone who's going to be descended from King David, who will come back and rule the world the way David, like the way David did, and reunite the people the way David had. And they very generally are picturing a individual. Like Mashiach means the anointed one, because that's what we used to do with kings. We used to anoint them with oil to signify that they are the king. And so the rabbinic text very clearly imagined an individual, which the traditionalists hold on to. I think the non-traditionalists have kind of reimagined in a different way. Stuart, you have been very patient through my rant, so I appreciate it. You're muted.
I have a difficulty with the concept of the Mashiach being an individual person. But I mean, one reason is unless you believe that this person is going to live forever and ever and ever, well, they're going to die, and then who's the next Mashiach? This sort of implied in here, in one point, that you could consider Israel as being the state of Israel as being metaphorically the Mashiach. And if we just imbue within Israel the characteristics that we expect the Mashiach to have, then now that's something that can last potentially forever, conceivably forever. And it does take it puts it into a realm that I can understand better rather than like Esther's problem with how do we think of the Mashiach?
Yeah, there is some move, and I'm not sure. I don't think it was in this chapter where they made that statement of Israel kind of being the Mashiach itself, of being like. I think that was a previous chapter, but I think that's a less traditionalist way to view it along the way, and I think. Look, I think we haven't. There's a long conversation we could have about messianism, um, and what that messianic age is supposed to look like. And I think broadly there are at least some views in which there there's a resurrection of the dead, and there is no death, and there is no illness, and there is no any of this afterwards. So the idea of like what's going to happen after the Mashiach, well, it's a messianic age. There's not going to be any. We don't have to worry about any of that. There's conversations about holidays no longer being needed except for Purim. Purim will be the only holiday that survives. But yeah, I do think. I think for a lot of us non-traditionalists, the idea of instilling all that power into one person feels a little challenging and problematic. Um, Traditionalists don't have that hang up generally, but I think we see a danger in, whereas we see a danger in one person having too much power. I think the traditionalists see it will be a miraculous occasion, and God will choose the individual, and it will be God's will. So we'll trust God that Mashiach won't abuse that power. Margid?
As I understand it, I thought that was a pretty original and creative idea of the religious Zionists to shift the view of an individual Mashiach to the idea of a collective one. But to Esther's point, also it seems to me that rather than, I mean, it is the idea of an individual Mashiach is a Christian idea, but it's directly taken from Judaism. And that's where my understanding is exactly where it comes from, and they just pretty much stopped there.
Yeah. The idea of an individual Messiah is taken directly from Judaism. And there's a scene in the New Testament where like Jesus is coming into Jerusalem with like 1 foot on a donkey and 1 foot on a horse. And the reason is because there's two different verses that describe the future Messiah, one describing him coming in on a horse and one describing him coming in on a donkey. So in that sense, the New Testament's trying to fuse both views and say Jesus is all of it. The concept, I think this is the part that Esther was struggling with. The idea that the Messiah would die and then come back again is not as clear in the Jewish scripture, in the Jewish Bible. And that seems to be something that Christians innovated a little more. And that's where I think she's struggling with the idea of Schneerson dying, but as the potential Messiah will return when God is ready for him to return.
So my question is, where in the history of rabbinic thought, or where does that come from?
Which part?
I think it comes from, what do you do when the person you think is a Messiah dies? Then you have to revise your story, right? Because he's gone. So now, yeah.
That may be the case, but I'm wondering if but I'm wondering if there is a part of the if there's a part of the history that I'm not aware of that specifically says that.
In terms of resurrection, yes. I mean, there are texts about resurrection that come in the Jewish Bible, and that in a messianic age there will be a resurrection of the dead and all that. Like, there are texts that are read in that way. Generally not referring specifically to the Messiah. The Messiah will usher in the resurrection, but there's really no presumption that the Messiah himself is going to die and then be back resurrected again. Not that I'm aware of, at least. Mm-hmm. Unless you read it as, well, he will be resurrected like everybody else. I'm sure there's some text that I am not super aware of that can probably be interpreted in that way, but off the top of my head, I don't know. Yes, Barbara Brandy.
I didn't understand that it was supposed to be a person who is living at the moment who then dies and tomorrow comes back as the Messiah. And the reason I'm thinking that is because the Rebbe Schneerson died in the early 90s. And it was a few years after that the Moshiach Now bumper stickers became really popular. Am I the only person who remembers Chabad cars with Moshiach Now on them? So I didn't know. I thought they were looking for a Messiah, but at that point, were they talking about someone they knew coming back as a Messiah, or just a Messiah?
So I think it's a little bit of both. I think they broadly want Mashiach. Whether that's Mashiach is Schneerson or whether that Mashiach is someone else, as long as Mashiach comes, that's all that that's the real goal. And the concept of the Rebbe being the Mashiach, it was not universally accepted within Chabad, and he kind of alludes to that here also. Like there are people who do, but there were Chabadniks who do not, but who are still praying for the Mashiach to come, whether it's Schneerson or not. Diane?
But Schneerson was a good guy, so let's bring him back.
So, in response to Barbara's comment, what I remember is that Jews have to live in a certain way, following Jewish laws and traditions to bring the Mashiach back. So I interpreted that sign on the back of the car as you need to practice your Judaism so that we can have the Messiah. So maybe I'm way off, but that's what I mean, that's just what I understood it to mean.
Well, broadly speaking, I think Chabad takes a Lurianic view of Messianism. So if you go down into Lurianic Kabbalah, called Lurianic because it's largely espoused by Rabbi Isaac Luria, who kind of described it. That when God first created the world, God created these vessels through which to pour the divine energy into the world that would create the world. The first time God did that, the vessels were not designed or were not organized in a way that they could contain all of the divine energy, and they all shattered. Therefore, God had to, it's unclear whether there were a few different arrangements and God was experimenting with what worked, but eventually God created a design that worked and was able to contain all the divine energy, which, if you know anything about Kabbalah, are called the Sefirot. However, all those shards of the previous vessels are still existent in this world. And part of our job in this world is to return those shards back to God, back to their source, and by doing so, tikkun olam, repair the world by repairing and returning these shards back to God, to where they belong. How do you do that? You do that by performing mitzvot. You do that by fulfilling all of the mitzvot that God offers you to do. So, in that sense, the more mitzvot you do, the more of these shards get returned back to God and their source. And when all of these shards are returned, that's when the Mashiach will come. Barbara Ailey.
I was just going to clarify that that's the traditionalist view, right? But the progressive view, which you talked about earlier, is justice and compassion and all those things that are repairing the world.
Yes, but the phrase tikkun olam is referenced in earlier texts, but in terms of repairing the world, comes from Lurianic Kabbalah. And then it gets redefined in progressive circles as meaning something else. Yes, Lynn.
So I think about, all right, God gave us free will. And so to me, he's testing us to do those things that you just said. But what if there was not the promise of a Messiah? why is there the promise of the Messiah? Why does there have to be the promise of the Messiah?
So I think part of the short answer to that world, or to that answer, is the world kind of stinks. Um, you know, um, as the Talmud phrases it, as sometimes the righteous people don't, their crops don't grow, and the wicked have plentiful crops. Sometimes good people struggle with all sorts of awful things in their lives. Um, Sometimes toddlers get cancer. Um, the world religiously strikes us as an incredibly uh, unfair place. So what do? You hope that there's a world and there's a future in which that unfairness no longer exists. You pray and hope that perhaps all of this unfairness will work itself back out in some future time. And that we hope for that time to come soon, so that the righteous don't feel like they were righteous, but that they their life stunk anyway. I think there's a level at which the rabbis early on understood that. Um, and they understood a little bit that the world works in natural ways, and the world works the way the world works. And they hoped for a time when things would balance back out. The wicked who are successful now will not be will not exist in the future world, whereas the righteous who suffer now will be rewarded in the future. Does that answer your question?
It's a marketing tool.
A little bit, perhaps.
I thought what you said was so beautiful, and it's funny because sitting here, I think the idea of a messianic age is much more powerful for me personally than the idea of God. And I mean, I feel like it's in a way like Judaism is so ancient, and so many people's ideas are included in it, that it has everything we need, and different people need different things. And for me, the idea that maybe it will never come, but that we're working towards a just world is so powerful to me. And so, like you said, it's hope. Hope is really important.
Yeah. Look, to Lynn's point, I do think there's a level at which it was a marketing tool for the rabbis early on. Be righteous now, you'll be rewarded later, even if not in this life, in the world to come, you might be. But I think as we think about and consider what is this, okay, so they developed this idea of a messianic age. What do we want it to look like? Now we have the ability to work our way towards building that. As I think it was a George Harrison song that I like to quote a lot. Like, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. But if you have a sense of, this is what I would picture as this ideal messianic age, now we have a direction we can try to work towards, and a direction we can try to build this world around, and to get it closer to that. The rabbis were also pretty open that, as they call it, there would be, as they call it, the birth pangs of the Messiah. that preceding that messianic age, there would be a time of awful war and devastation and destruction and death, and life would be actually pretty awful leading up to that messianic age. And I think it's an interesting metaphor they use because if those of you who have given birth know, I haven't, but I've heard it's awfully painful. And when it's done, you have this beautiful child that you're holding. I think that's the way they view leading up to the Messianic age as well, that it's going to be awful, it's going to be painful, it's going to be devastating, and this great Messianic age will come out of it. As one Rabbi Ula is quoted as saying, "Let the Messiah come and let me not be around to see it." Because if he's like, I don't want to have to view the devastation that's going to happen. Like, I want the Messiah to come. I just don't want to have to witness what everybody's going to have to go through for that to happen. Yes, Margaret.
And to that point, the idea that some of the traditionalists and certainly the Hill boys or whatever are putting forth the idea of an Israel that has a king, and that it's okay to kill little children in order to bring the Messiah.
Or at least Ginsburg did, yes.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of scary stuff.
Yeah. As I said, if you believe in a messianic age, then you believe that, and you have a vision of what it looks like, then you're trying to bring the world closer to it. As Feldman kind of points out last week with the evolutionists, that can kind of steer both ways.
The rabbi.
Like if you are envisioning, if you are envisioning a messianic age of justice and compassion and love and unity and equality, then you're going to try to steer the ship in that direction and the world in that direction. If you believe in a messianic age of the Jewish people having sole possession of all the biblical land of Israel, and that only Jews should be living in it, you're going to try to steer the ship in that direction. And therein lies, yet another challenge in messianism generally is we don't all agree on what this messianic age should look like, so it's very hard for us all to steer the ship in the same direction. Yes, Barbara, Aylin.
Well, I was just going to say, and for sure, the idea that times are going to be bad and terrible before the Messiah comes, the purpose of that was not to say, so make things bad and terrible so the Messiah would come. It was, don't give up hope when things are bad and terrible.
Yes. Yes, and I don't think Ginsburg and his followers think they're making things bad and terrible. I think I venture to agree most of us on this call, if not all of us on this call, do think they are. I don't think they think they are. Anytime you have to start rationalizing murdering children, that usually means you've probably gone off a wrong path. But and so that's just kind of my 2 cents of faith and religion. Other comments, thoughts, questions, either about the traditionalists broadly and their view of Israel, which we discussed before we got on a messianic sidetrack, or I guess on messianism, because that was our sidetrack.
So I'm just curious, since we got on a sidetrack about messianism that took almost the whole hour, whether it was, I just sort of wonder what people feel like. Is it something about this chapter that led to messianism, or is it messianism is something that puzzles us as the people on this call, and that's why I want to talk about it, because I didn't remember it in some sense being like a huge part of the chapter to me, but that could just be me.
It's both.
I kind of apologize for getting off on that track, but I guess for me, it was surprising that it was such a driving force in all these traditionalist factions in Israel. I guess that's where I was coming from, that this messianism was driving ultimately murder of children. And I think this impacts us all. And yeah, we got off on it, and it's certainly, this was about Israel, but it just surprised me.
Yes, Margaret?
It did seem to me that there were, broadly speaking, 2 points that he made in this chapter, and one was how the traditionalists came to accept the idea of Israel when that had not been their point of view before, and secondly, a great deal of discussion about messianism. So, I find it as surprising, perhaps, as Josh said, that
As I personally, it wasn't a driving force in the chapter, but it was underlying both this chapter and the previous chapter. In talking about the religious Zionists, what part of what's motivating the religious Zionists is an undercurrent of messianism and Israel as a messianic dream in and of itself. What's driving, what kind of drove traditionalists back into engaging with Israel was this. Okay, well, if we can't go back to Israel until there's a Messiah, so what if there is a Messiah, or what does this mean, and how does the Mashiach play a role in this, and how do we balance the reality with this messianic concept that we have?
So we're not supposed to go back without the Messiah. If we are back, that must mean it has something to do with the Messiah. Therefore,
I think it sounds a little bit like where Chabad ended up a little bit, is that, well, perhaps a Messiah is already here in potential.
Mm-hmm. This is part of the process, maybe, kind of, sort of.
And certainly we're fulfilling the part about things being really bad.
I personally didn't finish this chapter, unfortunately, but are there other people that didn't as well? I'm just wondering, do we want to move on next week? Or, I mean, I can certainly catch up. I'm not worried about that, but did we only talk about half the chapter, or did we talk about all the chapter?
I mean, we did not talk about all of the details of the chapter. Personally, I really did like the conversation between Ben Gurion and the Ben Ish Chai. I thought that was a fascinating little story and conversation between a secular Zionist and a traditionalist. The scary part about, if you didn't finish the chapter, the scary part about Ginsburg and what he loosely calls the Hilltop Youth is kind of frightening and scary, and worth reading to understand where they're coming from, and at least understanding who they are, because as I mentioned earlier, if people who broadly ascribe to their ideology are now getting high-level cabinet positions in the Israeli government, it's worth knowing what they're representing and where they're coming from. And I'll add that next week is a shorter chapter. So if you didn't finish, there's an opportunity to kind of catch up. And I think next week's only about 10 pages, and it's trying to synthesize these last 4 weeks and these last 4 chapters. So you should certainly have an opportunity to catch up if you did not finish the chapter.
I was,
But if people did want another week, I'm not opposed to it. I'm just sharing. Yes, Barbara.
well, I hadn't looked ahead to realize that the next chapter is as short as it is. And I think that there's been so much in this Israel chapter that I would really like us to have a week to sort of synthesize the ideas and bring them together. So it could be now, or it could be after we do the next relatively short chapter. But I think there's a lot of meat on the bones here. And we didn't talk about everything in this chapter, and we didn't talk about everything in the chapter before, the 3 or the 4. So I would like us to take it a little slow, but since I haven't read the next one, I don't know when the appropriate time to do that rehash or pick out the main ideas and make sure we've caught
So
them.
here's kind of what I'll suggest, and this will kind of be our closing, is let's go on to the next chapter next week, because I do think he's going to synthesize a lot of the last of the previous 4 chapters in it. And if there are additional questions, additional things that you wish that we haven't covered in the previous today and in the last 3 weeks, if there are things that you want, bring it next week. Kind of write it down, bring it next week. And if we don't cover it next week, maybe we'll take an additional week before going on to the 3rd section and we can cover some of those things that we haven't covered so far. How does that sound?
Okay with me.
I was trying to do my fawns, like, hey. All right. Well, kol hakavod, everyone. Thank you for learning together. Thank you for being here and joining us. And look forward to it next week. And if I don't see you before then, Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat shalom. Thank you. Bye.
Nice to see everyone.